So I heard over from Stefanski that he said over from the Satmar Rebbe. The Satmar Rebbe was once asked by a guy, why is it that Jews are so wealthy? So he answered, it's very simple. Because all Jews, 3 times a day, they go into the Besmedrash, and for a half hour straight, they think about their business. That was gewaltig. Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, first of all, can you see this? Can you see the Gemara on my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me turn back. We have to sort of review the Mishnah because the today's subject is all about the Mishnah. So I'm just going to go back for a second and we'll review the Mishnah. Okay, so at the bottom of Samach Zayin on the base, the Mishnah listed off a series of people who, if we're talking about a Bas Kohen, they would disqualify her from eating Truma. And if we're talking about a Bas Yisrael, they won't be able to get her the right to eat Truma. And the Gemara started going through the list one by one, explaining why. So let's just start from the Gemara where it says ha'uber. An uber will not be able to make a woman eat truma, and if a woman has the right to eat truma, it will remove that right. So the Gemara explains: Ibas kohen li Yisraeli. If a bas kohen married a Yisrael, so she has her DNA right to eat truma. When she marries a Yisrael, she loses her right to eat truma. So the halacha is pasala. So she married a Yisrael, and she was no longer allowed to eat truma. And then her husband died. So normally, the pasuk says it was this week's parsha. The pasuk says that she goes back to her father's household, but that's only if she's in the same condition as she was when she left her father's household, not pregnant. But if she's pregnant, then she cannot go back to her father's household and eat truma. So it says kinu ureah. It says v'shava l'beis avia kinu ureah, and we learn from there prat l'meuberes. This excludes a meuberes from returning to her father's household and be able to eat truma. Ibas Yisrael l'kohen. If the case was where a Bas Yisrael married a kohen, and by marrying a kohen she attained the right to eat truma, and her husband died but left her pregnant, loy machala, she will not be able to eat truma on account of her husband because she's pregnant. Now, once her child is born, then she will be able to eat truma on the account of the fact that she has a child from a kohen. But while she's pregnant, she may not eat truma. And the reason for it is Yilud Michael, She'eni Yilud Eina Michael. Again, the pasuk in this expression says, Kol Yilud Beisai, Yoichlu B'lachmoi. Anyone born in a kohen's household can eat truma, and we darshan it Yoichelu B'lachmoi. Any child born into a household will enable the mother to be able to eat truma. But that's only once the child is born. By a meuberes, it does not enable the mother to eat truma. Hayavam. The next case is the Yavam. The case of Yavam is Ibas Kohen li Yisraeli. So let's say there was a If there was a Bas Kohen, if a Bas Kohen married a Yisrael, so the halacha is possible. So imagine you have a Bas Kohen who's married to Yisrael, and her husband dies without any children. So normally she would go back to her father's household. But since she fell to Yibum, to her brother-in-law, that Zika prohibits her from eating Truma. Why? Because the pasuk says, after her husband dies, V'shava el beis avia, she goes back to her father's household. Prat l'shemeres yovim, who can't go back to her father's household, she still has to deal with the Zika to her brother-in-law.
What about if she does chalitza?
Yes, so then she goes back. Then she can eat truma again. And Ibas Yisrael the Kaini, what if it was the opposite? She was a Bas Yisrael and she married a Kaini. While she was living with the Kaini, she was allowed to eat truma. After the Kaini died, she wouldn't be allowed to eat truma. But in this case, she fell to Yibam, to her brother-in-law the Kaini. So you would think that since she fell to Yibum, she's allowed to eat Truma. Zok Gemara, no. Loy Machala, because Kinyan Kas by Amar Rachmana. The Kinyan Kesef of a Kohen can eat Truma. Vaha Kinyan Da'achavu. This isn't his Kedushin on this woman. This is merely the Zika that's left over from his brother's marriage. Rashi says that this is a Deraisa. Midaraisa, she's not allowed to eat Truma. Tosfos says it's only Midarabana. Because Midaraisa, since he's chayiv to give her mezainis, could be she's still allowed to eat Truma. The Erison. What's the case of Erison? Very simple. In Baskoin Yisraeli, let's say the Baskoin, and the Yisrael made Erison on her, possible. She becomes possible to eat Truma because it says in the pasuk, Kisia le'izor. If she is Sia means if she becomes the wife of a Zar, meaning Kedushin was done. The Konya Bahavaya. Since someone made Erison on her, a Yisrael made Erison on her, and she's now the wife of a Yisrael, she may no longer eat Truma. The Bas Yisrael Koini, and if she's a Bas Yisrael to a Kohen, so technically she's Sia to a Kohen, so therefore she should be able to eat Truma, and in fact she may eat Truma midaraisa. But midrabanan loy ma'ichala, midrabanan we do not allow her to eat Truma before Nisuin, mishum de Ula, because of Ula. And there were two reasons that Ula gave. Reason number one is, until he makes Nisuin, he has not been intimate with her yet. And it's possible that when he's intimate with her, he will find something about her that's a deal breaker. And he'll claim it was a mekachtos. If I would have known that she had 7 fingers, I would never have married her. And then Lemafreya, it turns out that the Kedushin wasn't a good Kedushin. But on that pretext, she would have been eating Truma, and that would have meant that she ate Truma when she wasn't allowed to. That's one Svara Bula. The other Svara is because we're afraid that when she's an Arusa, she doesn't live with her husband. She still lives with her family. And if her husband is going to send her Truma, she might be eating a delicious dish of Truma or drinking a delicious glass of wine of Truma. And her brother's going to come over and say, hey, that looks good. Can I taste some? And she will forget, and she'll let her brother taste some. And that means her brother, who's a Yisrael, would have eaten Truma. So because of that, we do not allow a woman who's a Rutha to a Kohen to eat Truma until she's in the Sulah. V'acherish, a deaf person, means a deaf mute, who's part of a mitzvah, so does not das, his marriage is not a marriage at all. So ibas Kohen li Yisrael, if it's a bas Kohen li Yisrael, really it's not a marriage at all. But nevertheless, possible. He'll still possible, even though it's not a marriage. The Kanya, but the Kanta the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon said that we have to recognize the Nisun of a Cherish, at least L'chomra, to answer this Bas Kohen from eating Truma. The Bas Yisrael Kohen, and if she's the Bas Yisrael to a Kohen, Loi Michael, surely he won't be able to be Michael with Truma, because technically it's not a Kedushin. Kinyan Kasbe Amar Rachmana, B'hai Lav Var Kinyan. A Cherish cannot make a Kinyan. And therefore, she's not considered the wife of a Kohen, so she surely cannot eat Truma. Okay, now we're up to the second part of the Mishnah, which is a little bit more complicated. So the Mishnah said the same thing applies to a Ben Teisha Shanim V'Yom Echad. What is significant about a 9-year-old child in one day? He's not a gadol, he's still a minor, but his bia is considered a bia. A child who's younger than 9 years in one day, his bia isn't even recognized as a bia. So, for instance, if a 3-year-old child did yibum, it wouldn't be yibum because there's no bia. But if a child who's 9 years in one day did bia on a yavama, it would be kaina because it doesn't need das. Yibum doesn't need das to be kaina. So even though this child's not a gadol yet, since his bia is a bia, he would still be kaina yavama. So Dr. Gemara Kasol Kedaita, what exactly is the case that the Mishnah is referring to when it says B'Teisha Shana V'Yom Echad? Einoi, the psak that the Mishnah seems to say applies to all of these items in the list is that Poisel V'Einei Michael. What is it referring to? If it's speaking about a Shemeres Yovem L'Teisha V'Yom Echad, if we're speaking about a woman who fell to Yibum to a boy who is 9 years and 1 day old. So let's think about it. Lamai. Elam Mistel, if you're going to suggest that he parcels her from eating Truma, So, for instance, if she was a Bas Kohen that was married to a Yisrael and her husband died, so now she was going to go back to her household to eat Truma, but she has a brother-in-law who's mechuyev to do evil. Zok the Gemara, Katan Nami Mifsal Pasal. Even if there's a brother-in-law that was 3 years old, it also would prevent her from eating Truma from her family's household. So why is the Mishnah saying a halacha that applies to someone who's 9 years and 1 day old? No matter how old this boy would be, who was her Yavim, he would prevent her from going back to her father's household and eating Truma. And eat lachule, and if maybe the chiddush is that if this Shemesh Yavim was a kohen, so you have a Bas Yisrael married to a kohen, she was allowed to eat Truma on his account. The kohen dies, so now she wouldn't be able to eat Truma anymore. But since there's a Yavim who's 9 years and 1 day old, she'll be able to continue eating Truma. That can't be, because Godol Nami Lei Michael. We just learned a moment ago that even if the Yavim was a Godol, she still wouldn't be able to eat Truma on his account, because it's not Kinyan Kesef. It's not a Kinyan of his. It's his brother's marriage. So what exactly is the Mishnah trying to teach us by telling us that this halacha applies to a 9-year-old? Amar Abaye, Hacha biyavim ben tesha shana v'yamechad haba yivim teskinon. We're not talking about a shemer shalom. The Mishnah is talking about a 9-year-old who actually made yibum. Now, if a 9-year-old made yibum, technically midaraisa, this woman is his wife. Midaraisa kanile. Midaraisa, he was kani this woman, and this woman is his wife. So kadaita chamina, I would have thought, hoil midaraisa kanile. Since midaraisa, he's kani this woman. Ubi afe bia, because his bia is a good bia. So emaloichel, maybe she should be able to eat truma on behalf of her husband, who's a kohen, even though he's a minor. Kamash malon midrabanon, they don't consider it a proper marriage. Rather, also bias bentes shana v'yamechad k'maimer begadol. And that is the chiddush. The chiddush of the halacha of ben teisha shana v'yamechad that the Mishnah is trying to teach us is merely that his yibum is not a good yibum midrabanon, and even if he did yibum, she would not be able to eat truma because of him. Now, our Mishnah said 2 halachas that apply to each of the items in the list. Poisel ve'enoi maichel. So the example that our Gemara just gave now was enoi maichel. Even though a kohen did yibum on this woman, and technically she's married to this minor kohen, she cannot eat truma. So that's the enoi maichel. What about the poisel? The poisel was poshut, meaning if it was a Bas Kohen married to a Yisrael, the Yisrael died, and now she made yibum to his younger brother, that I don't need a chiddush of a Mishnah to tell me that she's married to a Yisrael. Midaraisa, she's married to Yisrael. It's posted that Yisrael passes her. The chiddush is that even though he's a kohen and he's fully married to her because he did yibum, since he's a minor, Einei Michael, we will not let her eat truma on his account.
Could a cotton do a Kenyan?
No, but yibum he could do.
But if it
he
in,
can't do.
he could do yibum, but is it a good Kenyan?
Yes,
You're saying
is.
that. So this is an
exception.
This is an exception to the rule, or what?
That's right. Yibum is an exception. It's an anomaly. It's the only king that doesn't need das. Remember, we discussed that interesting case where someone fell off a balcony and he fell onto a woman.
Right.
Onto a woman. That would work. There's no das there whatsoever. So since das isn't required, even a cut of yibum would be effective. So that was Abaye's opinion. Where Rava doesn't like this shot in the Mishnah. Amalei Rava, that doesn't make sense. Because how are you going to then explain the next line in the Mishnah? Seifa, the Katani Sofik ben Teshanim v'yamechad Sofik she'enoi. What's the added chiddush here? Hashta vade ben Tes, we just said it a moment ago, that if he's for sure 9 years old in 1 day, or he's for sure a good bia, loy Michael, if he was kind to her with yibum, he still wouldn't be able to let her eat truma. Suffolk we boy, if we're not even sure if he's 9 years old in 1 day, for sure he can't be Michael or Truma. So the way you're learning, Ben Tess will not explain the next line in the Mishnah that applies this halacha to a suffix bentes because it's very, very partial. So therefore, Rava says we have to have another pshat in what the Mishnah is telling us. So Amar Rava, v'ventash neshanim v'yoymechad tahanach psulim. Katani the pasli b'viyos. There's a whole list of people that if they do bia on a bas kohen, this bas kohen becomes disqualified from eating truma. For instance, if a mamzer is ba on a bas kohen, he passes this bas kohen, and this bas kohen can no longer eat truma. The question is, what if this mamzer wasn't an adult? He was only ben teisha shanim v'yamechad. So our Mishnah is telling us that his bia is a good bia, and therefore, if any one of the psulim was ba on a bas kohen, as long as he's 9 years and 1 day old, he will disqualify this woman from being able to marry a kohen. Now it makes sense why the Mishnah would say that if it was a suffix bentes, he also disqualifies her from eating truma. So it's an extra chiddush. Not only if his bia is for sure a bia because he's older than 9 years old, but even if we're not sure, his bia will still be a good bia to disqualify a bas kohen from eating truma. And like we learned in a brayso, ben teisha shana v'yoymechad, a boy who's 9 years and 1 day old, if he's a ger amoni, now we know an amoni who becomes a ger may not marry a Jewish girl. He can marry another convert, but it says la yavi amoni b'kal Hashem. So he's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl. So he's surely not allowed to marry a kohen. So if he's 9 years and 1 day old and he has bia with a bas kohen, this bas kohen will no longer be able to eat truma. Moyavi, it applies to a Moyavi as well. That's our sugya because Rus was a Moyavia, but a Moyavi is not allowed to marry a Jewish girl. Mitzri, it says by a Mitzri, Dar Shlishi Yave Lahem Bekal. So the first 2 generations are not allowed to marry Jews. So we're talking about a Mitzri, either first generation or second generation. If he had relations with a bas kohen, she would not be able to eat truma. V'adoimi, the same thing with an adoimi, or a kuti, or a nesin, or a halal, or a mamzer. If you're either one of these boys who are only 9 years old, shabal kaihenes, levia v'yisraelis, paslua, these women can no longer eat truma. Now you might ask me, a kaihenes I understand. Up until now, she was able to eat truma. So if she's developed to one of these psulim, she can't eat truma anymore. But a levia and yisraelis, they weren't able to eat truma anyway. So the case would be, how do you have a case where Yisraelis can eat truma? Very simple. These Yisraelis was married to a kohen, and she had a child with the kohen, and then her husband, the kohen, died. So now she's a single mom. She's allowed to continue to eat truma because she has a child from the kohen. If she becomes nevelas to one of these psulim, even if the male who's boiler is only 9 years old and 1 day, she will now become disqualified from eating truma. That is the sheet of the Tanakh. However, Rabbi Yosy says a little differently. And when we read these words, we're not going to understand them. The Gemara will explain it tomorrow. So Rabbi Yosy Kol Shazari Posel. Anyone whose children are apostle, they'll passel a woman if they're boiler. But Kol She'ein Zari Posel, but if this person's zera is not possible, ain't a posel, it won't pass. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, a different rule. Kol Shata Noise Bitoy, if you're allowed to marry someone's daughter, Ata Noise Almanasai, you're also allowed to marry a woman who is boiled. If you cannot marry his daughter, you're not allowed to marry the woman who he was boiled. Again, we don't need to delve into this now. The Gemara will elaborate on these later. What we need to know is the first halacha. The first halacha is that according to Rabbi Yosy, any one of these psulim, as long as they're 9 years and 1 day old, their bia is a bia. And if they were boiled a woman who was allowed to eat truma, they will disqualify her from being able to eat truma. Mino hanamili. Where do you see in the Torah that if a woman gets bia from a person who's possible, she will become disqualified from eating truma? Amar Rabbi Amar Rav, Amar Kar, the pasuk says, and this is a pasuk again. We learned it today. It was the Levi, whoever got the Levi Aliyah, learned this pasuk and said, "Ubas koyin kisili izar." the daughter of a kohen who marries a strange man. Now, if you look at the pasuk at first glance, it seems like it's not talking about a woman who had bia, who was an iszar, someone who was puzzled. It sounds from the pasuk like it's talking about a bas kohen who married a Yisrael, and it's telling us that a kohen, a kohenes, a bas kohen who marries a Yisrael may no longer eat truma. But the Gemara here is saying that no, the iszar that we're referring to is not referring to a Yisrael; it's referring to one of the psulim, and it teaches us that kivan shenivala lepasala, once she did bia with someone who was puzzled to her, she's no longer allowed to eat truma. Frank the Gemara, how could you say that this pasuk, how could you say that this pasuk is telling you that if she was novellas to someone who's puzzled to her, she can't eat truma? Haimi boile, we need it for the basic shot in the pasuk. The Gomer Achmana, Baskoin the mitzvah Lazar, Baskoin who marries a Yisrael, loy seichel, she can no longer eat. So that's just what it means. Kitziel Lazar. Zok the Gemara, I don't need a pasuk to teach me. I don't need this pasuk to teach me that if a Baskoin marries a Yisrael, that she could no longer eat truma, because we know that halacha from a different pasuk. Hahi mi v'shava al beis avia kinureha. The pasuk says, "Batish kohen kitziya almana grusha." A Batish kohen who became an almana, or if she became a grusha, if she became an almana or she became an grusha, the halacha is v'shava al beis avia kinureha. She can go back to her father's household like she was before she got married, and milechem avia teichel, and she'll be able to go back to eating truma. Nafka, from there we learn that while she's married to a Yisrael, she may not eat truma. Since the Torah says that after she becomes an almana or a grusha, she can then go back to her father's household and eat truma. Mechalala teaches us the meikara, while she was still married to a Yisrael, lo yachla, she can't eat truma. So since we already know this halacha, that a woman who marries a Yisrael can no longer eat truma, then the pasuk of ubas koyin kisiya li'izdor, we can apply it not to a zor meaning a Yisrael, because we know that already. Rather, we can apply it to a zor, someone who is pasula, like a mamzer. The Dr. Gemara, that's not good yet, because if you only know the Easter for a woman who's married to a Yisrael to eat truma, if you only know it from the diak of Teichel once she's divorced, mashma, that before she's divorced, while she's still married, she may not eat truma, well, then it's a lav haba mechlala say. Imeahi havamina lav haba mechlala say. Then I would say that a woman who's married to Yisrael, a bas kohen who's married to Yisrael, may not eat truma, but it's only an isra say. It's not an isra lav. Zok the Gemara, kazer rachmana hai lelav. So we need the pasuk of ubas kohen kisiyel izar, that she's not allowed to eat truma. Maybe we need it for the lav. So then we don't have it available to teach us that a apostle who's boiler apostles her. Zok Gemara, I have another pasuk for the lav. Lav mivichol zar lo yechol kodesh nafka. There's an earlier pasuk that says v'chol zar lo yechol kodesh. That tells you that a bas kohen who marries an Yisrael has a lav. So you can use the next pasuk of bas kohen kisiyel yisor. That doesn't. We don't need it to teach us anything about a bas kohen who married Yisrael. We can use it to teach us that a bas kohen who was novellas to somebody that puzzles her like a mamzer will disqualify her from continuing to eat truma. Dr. Gemara, you know that Dr. Gemara, that's not going to help because I need that pasuk for something else. So let's turn the daf over. I need that to tell me that a zar, a Yisrael, cannot eat truma. Zok Gemara, Trei v'chal zar ksivi. There's actually two psukim in that parasha that says v'chal zar lo yechal kodesh, and we could learn from one pasuk. We know that Yisrael may not eat truma. From the other pasuk, we know a lav for a bas kohen who married a Yisrael. We know that there's an Isra lav for her to eat truma. And then, Ubas Kohen Kisiyel Yisdar, we still have available to teach us that if Askoin is nivelas by somebody who's possible to her, will no longer be able to eat Truma. Zakta Gemara, we still need it for another drasha. The Amar Rabbi Yosy Bar Chanina, V'chol Zar, teaches us that Zar is Tamartilach. A Zar may not eat Truma, but V'lo Yanidus, if a kohen is an oinin, that does not disqualify him from eating Truma. An oinin may eat Truma. Zakta Gemara, I have another extra to teach us this halacha. Rabbi Yosy Bar Chanina, min Zar V'chol Zar naf. It could have said Zar lo yachal kodesh. Why did they V'chol Zar? To tell us Davka Zar, but not an oinin. Correct Gemara, but I still have another limud that I need, so I don't have this extra pasuk. When a woman was married to Yisrael, she was not allowed to eat truma. Then her husband dies, so she goes back to her father's household, and she may once again resume eating truma. However, chayzeres l'truma, she's only allowed to eat truma, but ve'ena chayzeres l'chazav b'shay. We know whenever someone brings a carbon shlomim, the kohen gets the chazav b'shay. Now, the halach is his family is allowed to eat it, but this woman who was married to Yisrael and she came back home, even though she's allowed to eat truma, she would not be able to eat from the chazav b'shay. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Avina Bar Rav Shila. Mikra, where do you know this halacha from? Tichsibu vas koyin kisiya le'izar. A vas koyin who marries an izar, he v'trumas hakadshim loy soicha. She's no longer allowed to eat trumas hakadshim. And what does that mean? We learn that it means loy soichal b'muram min hakadshim. She may not eat from the part that's separated from the kadshim to be given to the koyin, namely the chazav b'shoik. So you need a pasuk to tell you that you can't eat the chazav b'shoik. How could you use this pasuk to teach you that if she's nivel al she may no longer eat truma? Dr. Gemara, im kain, if the only thing that it was teaching you was she doesn't eat the chazav b'shoik, lich lekra, he bekadishim loisoich. She can't eat kosher. My betrumas bekadishim. Obviously, the pasuk is telling me something extra. Shmami natarti. So now we have to do an inventory because we had so many different limudim that we squeezed out of all these extra psukim. So we first have the limud that we needed, that we started with, that a bas kohen who is nivelis by a pasala may no longer eat truma. We also need a pasuk to tell you that a bas kohen who married a Yisrael may not eat truma, and that it's not only an Yisrael say, but it's also an Yisrael lav. We also need a lav just generally to tell you that a Yisrael may not eat truma. We also need a limud to tell us that a kohen who's an oinin is indeed allowed to still eat truma, and we also need another limud to tell us that a bas kohen who comes home after a marriage to Yisrael, although she may resume eating truma, she's not allowed to eat anymore from the chazav b'shoik. So we learned in a little couple of lines, we packed in 6 important lessons. Zok to Gemara, let's do our inventory. Where are we holding? We've accomplished that a kohenes ubas ish kohen kisiya le'izar. I'm sorry, ubas kohen kisiya le'izar. The daughter of a kohen who had bia with someone who's possible, she becomes possible from eating truma. So ashkan kohenes, we found the makar for the kohenes, but levia v'yisraelis we know. How do we know a levia or a yisraelis who was married to a kohen and had a child with the kohen and therefore retained the right to be able to eat truma? How do we know that if they were nivelis to a mamzer or some other apostle, how do we know that they are disqualified from eating truma? Minolam. So like Rab Abba said in the name of Rav. Bas ubas. It doesn't say bas kohen k'sil yisar. It says ubas. There's an extra vav. So hachanami bas ubas. From the extra vav, we say it's not only talking about a kohen, it's not only talking about a bas kohen, it's talking about any woman who has a right to eat truma, such as a woman who had children with a kohen. Kaman. So who darshans these extra vavs? Rabbi Akiva to darish vavim. So this whole thing is based on Rabbi Akiva, who says you're allowed to darshan the extra vav. Not necessarily. Afilu temer rabbanon. Even if you don't darshan involves, the whole word ubas is extra. Kule ubas kori seru. Because we know we're speaking about a bas kohen. All it had to say was v'chisia le'izar. And we know we're talking about a bas kohen. So the fact that it says ubas kohen, that whole thing is extra. And from there we know that not only is the bas kohen disqualified from eating truma, but even a bas Yisrael or a bas Levi who was eating truma would become disqualified from a bia to apostle. Zog to Gemara, great. Truma. We know that a woman who is nevelas by apostle may no longer eat truma. But lekahuna minola. How do we know that they're no longer allowed to marry a kohen? Zog to Gemara, let's think about it. Atu levia v'Yisraelis loy lekahuna marbidinu. A levia and a Yisraelis, they cannot eat truma. So now the Gemara is not speaking about the case that I referred to earlier. Rather, it's speaking about a regular Levi and Yisraelis that were never married. Do I need a pasuk to tell me that those women can't eat truma? I don't need a pasuk. Dila truma, benois mechal truma. A regular Levi, a regular Yisraelis, never married. We don't need a pasuk to tell us that she can't eat truma. She's not allowed to eat truma. So the pasuk of the Chol Zor, Ubas Kohen, Kisiel Zor, if we're applying it to a Leviah or a Yisraelis, it could only possibly be disqualifying them from marrying a Kohen. So, what are you talking about? Alam aloi. Of course, I need the pasuk to tell me that even a Leviah and a Yisraelis are disqualified from eating truma, because there's a simple case, like we already discussed, where a Yisraelis and a Leviah are in fact allowed to eat truma. Mishkachas law dika achla b'shvil b'na. If she's eating on behalf of her son because she has a son from a kohen, for that we need a pasuk to tell us that if she was nevelas to pasuk, she could no longer eat truma. But how do we know that she's also now author from marrying a kohen again? Dr. Gemara, b'shvil b'da kal v'chaymer u'ma kohenes. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that if a woman was eating b'shvil b'da, that if she was nevelas to a pasuk, she can no longer eat truma. I know that from a kal v'chomer, and since I know that from a kal v'chomer, I can use this pasuk to tell me that a nevelas to pasuk is also to marry a kohen. So, what would be this kal v'chomer from where I would know that a bas Yisrael who was nevelas to someone who's also to her, she can no longer eat truma? Kal v'chomer u'ma kohenes the b'kedusha de nafsha ochla. A kohenes, a girl who was born a kohenes, she has a very strong DNA. Birthright to eat truma. That's a strong truma. Nevertheless, pasula. If she's nevelas to someone who's pasul, it will disqualify this woman with a strong connection to truma. She will become disqualified if she's nevelas to someone who she's also to be with. So Leviah Yisraelis, the loyachla of l'shul b'na, a Leviah Yisraelis, where their whole right to eat truma is very weak to begin with. It's only through their son. Surely they should be disqualified from eating truma if they were nevelas to someone who's possible. So therefore, I shouldn't need a pasuk to teach us that. So I have a pasuk to teach us that they're also to marry a kohen. But Zok Gemara, the kal v'chomer is not a good kal v'chomer, because in fact, if you look at it from a different perspective, the kal v'chomer will tell you exactly the opposite. V'hi anisenes, kohenes the kaddish gufa, a kohenes who's truly holy. She has the holiness of a kohen. She's much more fragile. The holier one is, the more susceptible one is to damage from a bad bia. Therefore, pasula. But but a woman who her right to eat truma had nothing to do with the kedusha of her guf. It's because she's able to eat it through her son. So therefore, if her guf becomes violated, that might not impact her right to eat truma, because her right to eat truma is not coming through the kedusha of her guf. It's coming through a different channel. So therefore, like pasuk. So once again, how do we know? We need a pasuk to teach us that a Yisraelis who was eating truma, that was nevelas to pasuk, can no longer eat truma. So where do we know that she may not marry a kohen? Elu lekahuna kal v'chomer migrusha. That we would know from a grusha. Uma grusha, madach, a woman who's divorced cannot marry a kohen. She muteres b'truma. She's allowed to eat truma. So a woman who was married to a kohen and she had a child with the kohen, and she got divorced. Since she had a child with the kohen, she can continue to eat truma. So a gerusha is allowed to eat truma, but asur l'kahuna, she's not allowed to marry a kohen. So you see, marriage to a kohen is more severe, is more strict than eating truma. So zuzha asur b'truma. So if I find a woman who's not even allowed to eat truma, eino din shapsul l'kahuna, surely she would be pasal l'kahuna. So therefore, I don't need a pasuk to teach us that these women cannot marry Kehanim once I already know that they cannot eat truma. Correct Gemara, you can't bring me a raya from a kal v'chaymer, v'chima asirin min adin. You can't bring a lav, you can't learn a lav, an isser to marry from a kal v'chaymer. So Gemara, we're not bringing an isser to marry from a kal v'chaymer. It's merely gilui milta ba'almu. The kal v'chaymer is teaching us what woman is called defiled. Then we have a lav that says separately, any defiled woman is not allowed to marry a kohen. Let's see Rashi right to the side of where we are. Gilu milta ba'almahu. V'lav melef minei alfinon lav l'kahuna mitruma. We're not learning a lav with a kal v'chaymer from truma to kahuna, because that would be ein masir min adin. Rather, the memela, even the istal of truma, it's a svara. Once a woman becomes puzzled from eating truma, ifsal la kahuna, that would puzzle her from kahuna. The truma and the kedusha is kahuna, because the ability to eat truma is the kedusha of kahuna. Once we know a woman does not have the kedusha of kahuna, well then you have the lav of the zor lo yoicha. A zor may not eat truma. Zok to Gemara, you brought a pasuk uvaskoin kisiya le'isor, she cannot eat truma, and you're assuming that what's an isor? It's a mamzer, it's an asin, it's an amoni, a mayovi. All of these women are prohibited to marry. All of these shulam are prohibited with a lav to marry a woman, a Jewish woman. How do you know that that's what type of prohibition the pasuk is talking about? Maybe the ema nivala lepasula means chayve krisus. Maybe when the Torah says v'chasiyali izar, she becomes pasul. That's only if she had bia from somebody that she would be chayiv koros from. That's a much more serious affair. How do you know that for a much more minor affair, only a chiyav lav? How do you know that would also disqualify her from eating truma? Zaktamar, I know it because it says kisiya amar rachmana. The pasuk says uvaskoin kisiya li'izar. Siya means that there was a tfisas kedushin. Kisiya amar rachmana, meaning hanach the isbu havaya, a woman who kedushin is typhus. Such a woman, if she has relations with this man, where kedushin is typhus, she'll be possible from eating truma. But chayve krisus lav b'nei havaya. The Torah cannot be referring to chayve krisus because it couldn't have used the word kisiya le'isar if it was describing chayve krisus, because the word siya is inappropriate to use with someone who's chayiv koros for this union because there is no tefisas kedushin. So that's how we know the pasuk is talking about chayve lav. Correct Gemara. Now that you're saying that the pasuk that's puzzling a woman from eating truma is only referring to those men who have a tefisas kedushin, if a woman has relations with an evet or with a goy, they can't do, their kedushin doesn't work. A goy or evet, their kedushin is useless. It doesn't do anything. So are you going to say that since they don't have kedushin, if they're boiled this woman, that she's still allowed to eat truma? That's not true. Zaktamar, you're right, it's not true. You know why? They're puzzled for a different reason. Hanach paslim with Rabbi Shmuel. They're talking not puzzled from our pasuk. This pasuk of Ubaskarin Kasil Yisor would not disqualify a woman who was nevelas to a goy or to an evet knaini. It wouldn't disqualify her from eating truma. But we have a different pasuk that disqualifies such a woman from eating truma. Zok the Gemara, Damar B'Yachim Shema B'Shmuel, V'nayin Lo'ovet Kachavim V'Evet Shabal Bas Yisrael V'Al Kohenes V'Leviyah. How do we know that if an Evet or a goy was born in Bas Yisrael or Kohenes or a Leviyah, Shepaslua, they passel her from eating truma and from marrying a kohen? Shenemar, actually they passel her from eating truma. Shenemar, once again in our parsha, it says Uvas kohen Kisiya Almana Grusha Vizera Einla Vishava Al Beisavir. So we darshan Dr. Gemara, let's turn over onto Samach Tesman and Aleph. We darshan Mishi Yeshle Almanus Begerushin. What type of woman, if she becomes an almana or a grusha, can go back to her father's household and resume eating truma? A woman who, if her husband dies, she's called an almana. A woman who, if her husband divorces her, is called a grusha. Yotzu oivit kechavim ve'eved she'ein lo almanus v'gerushin. An oivit kechavim or an eved, if a woman is married to an oivit kechavim and the oivit kechavim dies, she's not called an almana because she was never married to him. If a woman was married to a grusha, if a woman was married to a goy or an eved and he divorced her, she's not called a grusha because he never had kedushin on her. So therefore, a woman that's coming from an eved or an oivit kechavim, she will never be able to go back to her father's household to eat truma. So Zok Gemara, Ashkechan Kehenes. We know Kehenes has this halacha because we just quoted the pasuk. Uvas kohen sheyia almano grusha v'uzer einla. She goes back, but this whole pasuk is talking about a bas kohen. How do you know that you can apply this to a levia v'yisraelis minola? So Gemara, an exact repeat of what we just said a moment ago with the earlier pasuk of the Cholzor. Kedamar Abba Amarav bas ubas. It doesn't say bas kohen kisi almano grusha. It says ubas. It's the extra above. Hachanami bas ubas. Zok Gemara once again. Command Rabbi Kiva the Darish Vavi. Are you relying on Rabbi Kiva who holds you Kedash and extra vav? Zok Gemara no. Afilu temer Rabbanon kula ubas kro yiserahu. It didn't need to say the whole word ubas. It could have just said kisiya almana grusha. We know already that we're talking about a bas kohen. So since the whole word ubas is extra, we say that it doesn't only apply to a bas kohen. It applies to any woman who is nevelas by a goy or an eved will become disqualified from eating truma. Gewaltig. So we could stop here, and we'll be mamshech tomorrow. I want to wish everybody a good tavach, mazel tov, a happy Pesach Sheni, and a simcha d'kavach.
Kayach, good fuck.
Good.
Dusty,
Yes,
when's Pesach Sheni, first of all?
tonight, right now.
Well, I just have one quick question right near the end. Maybe I didn't understand it. First, we went ahead and gave a big argument why al savaya, that it's referring to somebody that could be typhus.
Like Kisiel Izdar is referring to somebody who kedushin is typhus.
Right. Then we turn around and we say, well, how would we know somebody that's scars?
Kedushin is not typhus.
And then we turn around and then we say, because of the fact that, what was the reason? What was that reason we just said?
Well, the more for evidence,
then we say like this, so that it shouldn't be a love. It seems like we just said backwards. We just said a minute ago. We just said it's more likely to be a love and not a chorus, and then we say it's more likely to be a chorus, not a love. Am I right?
So let's break it down. We have the project of Chisia Li'izar that tells us that a woman who's nevelas to pasula can no longer
go one step earlier. What's the question? The question is, it's more likely chayv krisis.
So allow me to go back. We have a project. So allow me to go back. It says that Chisia Li'izar, so a woman who's married to an Izar may not, relations with a pasula may not eat truma. So the question is, the most logical thing is that it's referring to the most severe type of Izdar,
right,
like a chayv increases. Dr. Moore, you're right. That's the most logical. But the problem is it says v'chisia. So the pasuk is specifically telling us we're speaking about a woman who kedushin will be typhus.
Okay, onward.
So the Gemara says that's great, but how do we know an eved and an akum where kedushin cannot be typhus? So you might ask, why go to eved and akum? How do we know by chayv increases that he would pass over? I believe that's what you're asking.
Something like that, yeah.
Why is the Gemara going to a third case of Eved and Akim who don't have Stavisas Kedushin? What about Chayve Krisis? Right?
Yeah, I'm saying
very, very
once
good
we said the Havaya, we've no longer found a place for the Chayve
How do we
Krisis.
know that Chayve Krisis also possible from eating Truma? Since the Torah is not talking about Chayve Krisis, the Torah is only talking about Chayve Lavan.
Right.
So let's look at the second wide line in Rashi. Who adin the Matinamal Memer Chayve Krisis lo livsum. When the Gemara asked, "How do I know Eved and Akum?" the Gemara could ask, "How do I know Chayve Krisis?" Now that you excluded them from the pasuk. Elazar Rashi, Mishum the Ari Behula il. But since we were speaking about Goyim earlier, the Ketani Kusi, Hanu Avik Lechavim. That's why the Gemara asked by Eved and Avik Lechavim. But in fact, the Gemara could just have easily said, if that's the case, how do I know that a Chayve Krisis would passel a woman from eating Truma?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Toyshet has a different shot.
I'll go the other way. Okay.
Toyshet has Pierce Bekundris. The wedding of the Matzal name and Nami Chayve Krisis will live salu. Will not get over the Chavim Eved, Mishum the Aribu il. So Zak Toys the Koshalari. He holds Kuti doesn't mean a goy. So that's not a good reason why the Gemara went to Evet. So Venirlari, the Pshita Leila Hashas, the Iker Kra, the Leizar, Ari B'Chayve Krisis. The Etim, the Gemara knows Avada, the Pasuk is referring to Chayve Krisis, even though it says V'Chisia. Kedama V'Perk Asar Yochsin. So we know that. Elamai, V'Haki Parach. V'Eman Niftel Al Apostle of Chayve Krisis, Dafka, V'Loi Chayve Lavan. Maybe the pasuk is only speaking about Chayve Krisis and not Chayve Lavan. Mishani Kisiya Amar Rachman Al Rabbi is Chayve Lavan. So Chisiya is not telling me that the pasuk is only referring to Chayve Lavan. The pasuk is telling me that the pasuk is also referring.
That's
to
what I
Lavan.
thought you were going to say when the first words came up. When it said Hanchlis Behavaya, I thought it was going to say including Chayve Lavan. And not,
but the problem is I knew Rashi when I read those words.
Because so the logic is if it goes to Chayve Lavan, it certainly goes to Chayve Krisis.
That's right.
Okay, let's go now. Thank you. Now go one more step. Okay.
Because there's because Kedushin is not Toifis, and by the way, they're not Chayve Krisis either.
What are they?
Chayve Lavan.
They're Chayve Lavan, but still don't have a vaya.
But there's no exactly. So they don't. So how do you know those? So for that, you need a separate.
Okay. So now, and I want to get that last part. But it's not necessarily of taking away from the answer of right. So we got the answer for according to Rashi, Krisis was left out, but it's covered anyways because it's the same thing. Correct. According to Toises, Krisis is never left out because the Havaya doesn't exclude Krisis, it just includes Lavan.
Correct. That's why I understood it.
I got it. Okay. I get it. That's okay.
Okay, Shkaya.
Have a good night.
Yeah.